Hello, health champions. What if I told you that there was a condition that was more deadly and more prevalent than cancer, and yet you had almost complete control and choice over how it affected you? Well, the thing is that humans are driven by fear. Humans will do more to avoid fear than virtually anything else. It's a very strong emotion. The problem here is that we are usually afraid of the wrong thing. So as an example here, we have 900,000 black bears in the United States. And a lot of people are afraid of bears. If they were to run into one of these, they'd be terrified. And up in the mountains near to where I live, there's this culture of they try to scare you. They put signs up in restaurants and so forth. So it's part of the culture to be afraid of bears. And yet, there's less than one death per year in the United States, the entire country, less than one death per year. And virtually all those cases, it was the bear who was provoked by the human. The human initiated it. Another example is bees, hornets, and wasps. And I would bet that more people would be afraid of a bear than a wasp if they came across one. And yet, bees and wasps cause 700 deaths per year in the United States. Another example is flying. A lot of people are terrified of flying, and the reason people are scared of flying is that if there is a disaster, even though no matter how small the risk is, if there is a disaster, it is so definite, it is so sudden. The person in the accident has no control over the matter anymore, and that is very, very scary. But let's make some comparisons. Now, a plane can hold hundreds of people, but on average, a commercial flight holds about 100 people per flight. And by the way, the vast majority of airplane accidents and deaths are on private small aircraft, not on commercial airliners. And I'm going to give you some numbers and data, and if you'd like to have the slides to follow along and to review later, there's a link down below where you can get those. Now here's a question for you. What if we had an airliner that went down, we had a terrible accident, and there were no survivors? Do you think that would get some attention? I would bet that it would. The media would be all over it. There would be investigations brewing. Now, what if a few hours later, the same day, the second plane went down, no survivors? That would really get the attention. And what if we had a third and a fourth plane go down on the same day, no survivors? What do you think would happen? I would bet that virtually all air travel would be suspended until they had figured this out, because it would be so disastrous, be such a big deal that no one would be allowed to fly because of that potential risk. There would be investigations, and they would change regulations and policies and security protocols, etc., until they had figured it out and they could make sure that didn't happen again. But now, let's say that there's this condition that can cause an equivalent amount of death and suffering. And now we're not just talking about one plane, we're actually talking about 57 flights going down, and there are no survivors. But we're not even talking about every day, we're talking every hour of every day, year-round. This condition would kill enough people to be equivalent of 1,380 flights per day, 504,000 flights per year. And what if I told you that it gets even worse, because this is completely preventable. 98, 99% preventable, and 98, 99% reversible. And not only that, but this is well known. It's published in papers, it's part of policy, and for anyone interested, they can just research it and find out. Now, is it just me, or do you think that we should do something about this? Well, I certainly think that we should. Now, the thing we're talking about is chronic metabolic disease, and it's very well known. It's published over and over and over that lifestyle choices are the #1 cause of chronic degenerative disease. And some aspects of this are things like obesity, metabolic disease, chronic low-grade inflammation, and insulin resistance. And when we talk about this, we really need to focus in on the insulin resistance because that is really the commonality of all these other things. And even though we usually call these diseases or conditions, what we have to understand is that they are metabolic adaptations. The body adapts to something that we do to it. If we stop doing that thing, the body will start reversing that adaptation in most cases. Now let's talk a little bit about insulin resistance because that's the key to all of this. And the thing we need to understand is that blood glucose is necessary. We burn mostly fat, that's our preferred fuel, but a little bit of glucose is necessary. However, very high or very low levels of glucose is extremely toxic. High or low levels at the extreme will put us into a coma, and we can die from that if there's no one around to assist us. And it's an emergency, basically, whenever we have a very high glucose. So insulin is what regulates this blood glucose. And here's how that works. That there is a certain range that we like to keep our glucose in. And let's just call it 80. So somewhere in the 80s, that's our good fasting blood glucose. And when we eat, it's not supposed to go much higher than that. So when you eat, your blood sugar starts rising. And then there is this hormone that we talked about called insulin that comes in, and it rises slightly after. There's a little bit of lag, but the insulin follows the blood glucose, and insulin is like a guide or a key that opens a door and lets the glucose into the cell where it can start doing the work. And then as insulin does the work, glucose goes down and we store the excess. We can use a little bit in this moment, but whatever we have extra gets stored, and then we can pull from that glucose, and the body knows how to regulate and balance this glucose so we have energy from glucose and fat until we have a chance to eat the next time. And then as the glucose comes down and levels off, so does the insulin. And that's how it works in an ideal situation. But if we start eating a lot of sugar and a lot of snacks, frequent meals, and we eat all the time and we eat too much, now what happens is over time our glucose will rise much higher and much faster because glucose gets in the bloodstream faster, but also because insulin isn't working. The cells start resisting that frequent push of insulin. Anything that happens a lot frequently, the cells will tend to resist. So here, not only is the glucose going high, but it's not balanced to the glucose because we need more when the cells are resistant. So now we get extremely high levels of insulin, and it takes much, much longer for the glucose to start coming down. So we have hyperglycemia, high blood glucose for long periods of time before it ever comes down. And usually it doesn't come down as low as in an ideal situation, but it might come down to 100, 110, 120, which is getting close to diabetic. And also there is a delay now with the insulin. So we have much higher levels for a much longer period of time. And this is what insulin resistance is. When the cell is resisting insulin, the levels will go much, much higher to have any chance at all to bring that blood glucose down again. And here's where this comes in to the metabolic disease, because we're creating a vicious cycle with this, because insulin is a storage hormone. And that's a good thing because it can store a little bit of food for us during a feast so that we can have something to live off, stored energy, when there is a famine. But when we eat all the time and insulin gets really, really high, Now the fact that it's a storage hormone creates all kinds of problems, because high levels of insulin promotes lipogenesis, meaning the formation of fat. Your body takes this extra glucose and turns it into fat, because that's one of the ways it can get rid of that glucose. The other thing it does is it prevents lipolysis. The high levels of insulin keeps the body from breaking down fat. So even if you're healthy, then you store a little bit, but insulin is low, so now you can pull that fat, that energy out of the stores and use it for the next meal, and you're fine, you're balanced. When insulin is high and you make more fat and you break down less fat, now instead of you can't use that fat from the store, so you have no energy. Even though you have massive amounts of energy stored as fat, you can't get it back. You can't pull it out for energy, and instead you get hungry. And this is the vicious cycle that creates diabetes and metabolic syndrome and congestion, and it makes it very hard to lose weight, and it makes you more hungry. So there's all these factors working against you. What used to be a beautiful, balanced system gets completely blown out of proportion when we eat too frequently and we eat sugar and processed foods frequently. And here's what we need to understand further about insulin resistance, that the simplest way of explaining it is that since insulin regulates blood sugar and carbohydrates turn into blood sugar, this is really nothing more than a carbohydrate intolerance. And then we have all these people that tell us that you should eat tons of carbs, that carbs are good for you, but we have to understand the context that if you are carbohydrate intolerant, then there's basically like this system, there's like this machine in your body that can process and work through and tolerate carbohydrates. But if you're intolerant, you broke that system, you broke that machine. It's not working anymore, and now carbs are not good for you. So if you can tolerate them, if your machine is still working, then yes, a certain amount of carbohydrates can be totally fine. You don't need them, they're not vital or essential, but you can certainly tolerate a fair amount of carbohydrate. So let's take an example when they say that peanuts are good for you. They're full of protein and fats, and they do some people a lot of good. But if you're allergic, if you have an anaphylactic reaction, then they'll kill you. So yeah, they're good for you unless they kill you. And if we take another example, that a glass of wine, it's so great. It's been shown that you take a glass of wine and you live longer, you have less heart disease, less inflammation, less atherosclerosis, unless you're an alcoholic. Now that doesn't work anymore. So if you are intolerant, then they're not good for you. So that's the perspective we have to understand. And the things that raise blood sugar and that cause these problems the most are things like sugar. But when we say sugar, a lot of people just think of these white crystals that you add with a spoon, and then they think, well, hey, I don't really do that very much, so I'm probably okay. But all carbohydrates turn to sugar at some point. So the sucrose is worst because it's 50% glucose, 50% fructose. The glucose raises blood sugar like we talked about. The fructose clogs up the liver, causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is one of the worst, strongest components of insulin resistance. So sugar is the worst. And it's not just what you add, it's anything that's sweetened, but especially candy and cookies and cakes and ice cream and so forth. And then people think, well, I don't eat any of those, but I have cereal. Those are good for you. That's part of a healthy breakfast, they've been told. And it's not just kids' cereals, but most cereals are loaded with sugar. And then, of course, the thing a lot of people don't think about is things like soda and lemonade and sweet tea and things that you drink with food that are just loaded with sugar. So while people are afraid of bears and bees and flying, These are the things you should be very, very afraid of. People are afraid of accidents. And yes, there are accidents. I think you should be cautious. But if someone has an accident and loses a leg, that does happen. It's very tragic. But did you know that diabetes causes 154,000 amputations per year only in the United States? And out of the diabetics in this country, 1.5 million have severe diabetic retinopathy. That means the back of the eye where you create the image, the vision sensors, it's getting destroyed to the point where you're about to lose your vision. Not all of these will go completely blind, but a lot of them will. Here's a list of the things that cause the most suffering and premature deaths. Number 1 is heart disease, 19.6 million people per year around the world. Cancer is 10 million. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is 7.6 million. We have diabetes at 6.7, and we have strokes at 6.5. And if we add all this up, that's 50.4 million people around the world, and this is where I got the 504,000 airplane accidents that would be equivalent. And when we look at it this way, it's a wake-up call for a lot of people. 504,000 crashes, but this is something that we actually have a lot of control over. But then other people will quickly think of something to get out of making changes and taking personal responsibility. So they say, well, you have to die from something after all, right? Which is absolutely true. So let's put this in perspective and talk about what's really important. So out of those 50 million deaths, premature, causing a lot of suffering, there's not all of them. It's not 100%. There's probably only 80% because there are other causes. So that would put us at about 40 million people, which is still a lot every year. And it doesn't postpone death indefinitely. It only delays it probably about 10 years. I would say you can make a good case for living an extra 10 years if you take good care of yourself, that these diseases, these conditions probably shorten it by 10 years. But that's not really what it's about anyway. But then some people say, well, you know, I don't care about the 10 years. I'd rather be dead than blank. And you can fill in whatever you like. I'd rather be dead than giving up my ice cream, my hamburgers, my donuts, my waffles, etc., etc., because sugar is a very powerful drug. It's a very addictive substance. But this is what I want you to really think about. It's not about the number of years that you have. It's about the quality of life that you have while you're living. So it's not about just adding years to life. It's about adding life to the years. And if we think about 80%, that's not just 80% per year. It's 80% of all the people on the planet that could dramatically improve their quality of life. So there's 8 billion people or so 6.5 could easily transform and have a much more beautiful, greater quality of life for up to 40 years extra that they would enjoy at a different level. So where a lot of people today with a lot of stress and junk food and toxins, etc., when they're born, they're still sort of clean, but then as they live a few decades, they get into a place where their body starts to ache, they need some medication, their blood pressure goes up, their digestion doesn't work quite right, they don't sleep the way they're supposed to. So maybe half of their life is where they have a good, high quality of life. Whereas I'm arguing that if you make some changes, if you learn how the body works, if you get some blood work, if you understand your body and make some changes, you could extend that period where you have quality of a life probably double. And that's where the value of these changes are. So just how strict you have to be to get some of these lifestyle, these quality of life changes? Well, carbohydrates, which we're talking mostly about here, is not the only thing you need to change. You need to learn about how the body works and take care of all aspects of health. But in terms of carbohydrates, to reverse metabolic disease, you need to be very strict. And what does that mean? Well, it means different things for different people. You need to be strict enough. So if we're talking about maintaining health, then it's all about finding a balance for that individual. So to give some examples, if we're talking about sugar, then I would suggest to reverse disease, you probably want to be at 0. I think you should cut out sugar altogether and eat 0 grams of added sugar and absolute minimum amounts of fruit and berry sugar. If you are maintaining health, if you found your metabolic balance, if you're at your ideal weight and your body is working, I think that you could probably get up to somewhere around 20 grams of sugar per day and still maintain health, if that's what you wanted to do. Some people, once they cut it out and they learn how good real food is, then they don't really have much of an attraction for that sugar. But you also, if you have a very, very strong addiction to sugar, like an alcoholic to alcohol, if you have just a tiny little bit and it sets you off again, then you should probably plan to be at 0 sugar, 0 added sugar forever, because it just doesn't work for you. And in terms of carbohydrates, I think for some people, once they're at maintenance, they can get up to probably somewhere around 70, 80 grams on average per day, net carbs. Whereas if you're trying to reverse disease, you should probably try to get down toward 20. For some people, it's enough to be below 50. Some people need to get all the way down to 0. So again, it's different for different people, but we need to understand where we are. We need to use trial and error to learn how our bodies work and then find that balance for us. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is they have this temporary mentality, this intervention mentality, where they think they can do something bad for 20 years and then do something good for a limited time and then go back to doing the bad and everything will be well. Well, it doesn't work like that. If you go back to doing the bad stuff you did to get in trouble in the first place, you will get in trouble again. It's as simple as that. Another reason we don't understand the devastating impacts of metabolic disease and chronic degenerative disease is that it doesn't kill us fast enough. Bullets and planes and car accidents and accidents, they kill us instantly, so we get the message. However, degenerative disease doesn't act fast enough because it doesn't threaten the survival of the species. We can still make babies and procreate while we're young, and then these diseases happen later on. It has no effect, no impact on our ability to keep the species going. Also, it doesn't really have much of an urgency. If something could happen or will probably happen 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, it doesn't have much of an urgency for most people. Some people, they just want the best out of life. They want to optimize their health. They're planning for a long, healthy, high-quality life. And to them, it is urgent. But for most people, not really. And also, degenerative disease doesn't get much spotlight. When people die from diabetes or heart disease, they usually die one at a time at home or in a hospital. There's not much fanfare, there's not much excitement. It's a tragedy and there is no spotlight on it. Imagine, on the other hand, if degenerative disease took us out differently, like a plane crash. If you were in a football stadium and there's 50,000 people around you and they're having a good time, and all of a sudden 500 people drop dead as if on cue, and something dramatic, something incredibly dynamic and disastrous happen, and they start losing body parts all over the place, and then they just go out with fanfare, then we would have a completely different picture. But the problem is, with degenerative disease, it doesn't create any urgency or spotlight. It doesn't get any attention. And that is why it is so important that you make it urgent. If you want to avoid that disease process, if you want to extend your quality of life, then you need to understand what it does, what our lifestyle does to us, and then make it urgent for you so you make those changes. So that means if you're watching this and you don't have any problems and in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, don't wait. You can count on these things happening if you don't change. And the good news is, if you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, then make the changes now and understand that it's never too late. That most of these things, it's always better to do it sooner, obviously, but it's never too late. And all of these things are adaptations. The body adapts to an unhealthy lifestyle. And if you change that lifestyle, then the body will reverse the adaptation. Another reason we don't change is that we think change is hard. We have resistance to changes. But in fact, if we just educate ourselves and make it a big deal, then change is super easy. Or at the very least, change is a lot easier than suffering. Change is a lot easier than getting cancer. It's a lot easier than a heart attack. It's a lot easier than a stroke. And it's a lot easier than ending up in a wheelchair. Now, I sympathize so much with people who have accidents and end up in wheelchairs for one reason or another. But imagine putting yourself in the wheelchair. How devastating would that be to know that you had the choice early on and all you had to do was make some simple changes. And what you will probably find also is that change is delicious. Once you get off that sugar and that processed garbage and all those chemicals, now your taste buds will wake up again. They'll come back to life and you'll start appreciating the real flavors of food, and you will experience flavors like you never have before, or at least not in a long time. And the other thing is that change feels good. If you read some of the tens of thousands of comments that people leave on these videos, they'll talk about how they lost the weight, and they talk about how they got off medication, how their blood pressure came down. But most of all, they talk about how good they feel, how they can do things they haven't done in 30 years, how they love hiking and playing sports and playing with their grandkids, and how they feel better than they did 30 years ago. That's what we're talking about. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.